There is a moment that slips by as quietly as the final breath of a dream. When you realize no one truly cares. No one listens to the silence you carry. No one stays behind to understand the exhaustion you've hidden behind polite nods and perfectly timed smiles. You believe that if you hurt enough, the world would stop, but it doesn't. It moves past you not out of malice, but because it's already spinning with other people's pain. And within that cold truth, you awaken. No more pretending, no more bending yourself to be digestible, lovable, or easy to understand. You rise in silence, not because someone is watching, but because you know. If you don't lift yourself, no one will do it for you. That silence which once drove you to despair now becomes your foundation. And from that foundation, you no longer live to be seen, but to become undeniable. 1. When no one cares, you wake up. There's a truth no one teaches you, but life will whisper it into your ear in the most ruthless way. No one really cares how you feel. They don't care that you're collapsing inside your mind. They don't notice you're fighting every day just to keep one part of yourself intact. The world doesn't stop to comfort anyone, and no one is granted the privilege of being understood just because they're hurting. You once believed that if you hurt enough, someone would notice. If you said it the right way, someone would understand. You once used silence as a cry for help, poured your heart into a single message, swallowed your tears, hoping someone would turn around and ask, "Are you okay?" But no one came back. No words arrived in time. No one knocked at midnight carrying the warmth you always believed you deserved. Only silence remained. A silence cold as stone, falling like icy rain on the days you needed sunlight the most. And in that very moment, you come to understand one thing: not that you don't matter, but that everyone is wrestling with their own pain. They don't see you, not because you're too small, but because they're blinded by their own wounds. They don't hear you, not because your voice is weak, but because their minds are crowded with their own noise. When you accept this, the anger within you begins to dissolve. And in its place comes something else deeper, sharper, but steadier: awakening. Awakening doesn't come like a brilliant flash of light. It comes like a cold cut. It doesn't hold you, it pushes you out of the last comfort zone you've clung to, the hope that someone will come and heal you, but no one comes. No arm reaches down to pull you from the cliff. No eyes look into yours and say, "I understand." And you're forced to do something you never thought you were strong enough to do: rise alone. Step out of the emotional hole by yourself. Become the main character in the story where you once stood only as a spectator, waiting for someone else to write the next chapter. When no one cares, you are forced to learn how to care for yourself. When no one listens, you begin to hear the whisper within you, the voice long drowned out by the craving to be noticed. And when you realize that voice is still there, needing no audience, no applause, no one's validation, you begin to see something you've never believed before. You are enough. You don't need to be seen to know you're worthy. You don't need someone to witness your pain for it to be real. You don't need someone to call your name to justify your existence. And you don't need anyone's understanding to make your life meaningful. You understand it not through words, but through experience. That is the beginning of a different kind of strength, not loud, not performative, not dependent, but deep, clear, and real. From that moment on, you are no longer someone waiting to be loved. You are someone walking needing no proof, needing no rescue, and strangely, only when you stop needing others to care, do you finally start to live not for anyone's gaze, but for the light that's just begun to rise within you. 2. Expectation is the fire that burns freedom. We grow up in a world where expectation isn't a choice, it's a burden placed on our shoulders before we even know who we are. We learn to smile at the right time, say the easy things, live within scripts written by others just to be accepted. And gradually, we forget that living true to ourselves was never part of the crowd's agenda. Expectation begins as guidance, but soon becomes a gilded cage. It promises love if you behave, validation if you comply, and peace if you don't disappoint. But it's all conditional. And where conditions exist, freedom cannot. Expectation is a sweet flame. It makes you believe that if you're good enough, kind enough, capable enough, you'll be understood. But it's a seductive lie, because no one truly understands you through the things you do to please them. They only know the version of you shaped by fear. Fear of being abandoned, judged, unloved. You become a performer for the crowd's approval. Every gesture is calculated, every decision filtered through the question, will this make me accepted? And in that play, you are no longer yourself, you're just a puppet that smiles, bows, and performs the right moves. Ironically, we often think freedom is taken away by power or oppression. But sometimes, the sweetest form of coercion is the expectation from those we love most. Parents expect you to become the model they dreamed of. Friends expect you not to change too fast, not to stand out too far. The world expects you to be understandable, agreeable, to fit the label they have already stamped on you. And you, afraid of losing connection, agree to confine yourself within limits you didn't choose. You trade freedom for fragile affection, which you only get as long as you keep playing your part. But every role eventually exhausts you. One day, you look in the mirror and realize the eyes staring back no longer belong to you. They belong to someone who's lived too long under others' expectations and now doesn't know who they'll be if everything is stripped away. And right then, you understand why you've always felt trapped, even when no one locked the door. Because the cage isn't out there, it's in your mind. It's built from shoulds and musts, from the fear of being ridiculed, from the habit of asking permission just to be yourself. And freedom, if it comes, won't arrive by smashing that cage with brute force. It comes when you dare to stand still and watch the fire of expectation burn you down to see what's left standing in the ashes. No one will rescue you from expectation, because expectation isn't out there. It's a part of you that you've unconsciously protected as duty. The moment you stop seeking approval, stop striving to meet standards is the moment you reclaim the right to breathe in your own rhythm. Others may not understand. They may be disappointed. They may walk away. But for the first time in a long time, you'll feel the space to exist without editing yourself. Freedom is not rebellion. It's the resolute silence of someone who has understood. No one can bind you unless you offer them the rope. 3. Pain doesn't need recognition to be valid. There's a common illusion that for pain to be real, it must be seen. That if no one knows what you're going through, the pain somehow becomes small, vague, even unreal. So we learn to tell, to seek attention, to ask for validation. We think that external understanding is what gives inner wounds their meaning. But the truth is, pain doesn't need witnesses to exist. It doesn't need anyone to declare it worthy. It is real simply because you are living in it. Pain is not a performance. It doesn't need comfort to be legitimate. And you don't have to expose your darkest parts just to awe and fleeting sympathy. Some wounds only need your own touch alone. Some sufferings should only be whispered to your inner world, where silence is not absence, but a form of reverence. Recognition doesn't create the value of pain, and often the need to be recognized corrodes its truth. Because once you start editing your emotions to fit someone else's ears, you're no longer healing, you're performing. We live in an age where every sorrow is encouraged to surface. But not all wounds need sharing to heal. Some pains require absolute stillness to sink into your core, and from there dissolve, not be preserved through retelling. Storytelling can be a release, but it can also be an anchor, holding you in a storm you've already passed. Not because you're weak, but because you haven't yet learned to hold your suffering fully, without being haunted by whether anyone understands. Epictetus once reminded, "Don't wait for others to agree before believing something is true." That applies to feelings too. Don't wait for someone to acknowledge your pain before you call it real. Don't think the silence of the world is the denial of life. Maybe life is teaching you this. Some pains exist so you can become a version of yourself that doesn't need an audience. One who can witness their own collapse and also be the one calm enough to rebuild from the wreckage. No outside gaze can make your pain more profound, and no apathy can make it smaller. Pain is pain. And sometimes, the bravest thing isn't recounting all you've endured, but being silent enough not to let it define you. No one needs to know everything you've lived through. No one is obligated to understand your inner chaos, but you, if you're strong enough not to need understanding, will discover a rare kind of freedom. Freedom from the hope that someone out there can heal you. Pain can be a storm, but only when no one is watching or judging do you finally have the chance to stand within it and quietly grow. 4. From expectation to clarity. The first shift of power. Power does not begin with muscle, with a firm voice, or with authority others assign to you. It begins in a quiet place, in the moment you dare to face the expectations that have swallowed your life. We grow up believing that if we live well, we'll be loved. If we give, we'll be rewarded. If we're hurt, someone will come and heal us. But that's not reality. It's a fictional contract between us and the world. And the hardest part isn't realizing that contract is broken, but that it never existed. Expectation makes us wait for things never promised, believe in things never guaranteed, feel disappointed by things never certain. You wait for someone to notice how hard you've tried, but they're busy living their own lives. You hope that by enduring pain without complaining, at least someone will understand, but they aren't there to listen. You assume that staying silent at the right moment means someone will be sensitive enough to ask what you need, but all they see is distance. None of these are attacks, they're simply proof of one simple truth. The world does not revolve around your inner rhythm. What kills your peace is not truth itself, but the gap between truth and expectation. When you stop expecting, you begin to see clearly. You see others as they are not as you hoped they would be. You see indifference as busyness, not insult. You see silence as personal boundaries, not rejection. Clarity doesn't come from coldness, but from no longer telling yourself comforting but false stories about others and about yourself. Seneca once wrote, "Nothing happens to man that is not human by nature." We are not hurt because the world is harsh, but because we believed it to be gentler than it is. Yet when you let go of that illusion, you step into a new space where you are no longer a victim of disappointment, but a master of understanding. And understanding in its stillness is a terrifying strength. When you are clear, you act not from reaction, but from choice. You don't do things to be noticed, but to stay true to your path. You don't love to be loved back, but because you choose to love unconditionally. You don't stay silent so others notice something, but because silence is what you need. Every action becomes lean, precise, intentional, and that's when you begin to operate like a true force. No one teaches you clarity. They teach you to dream, to hope, to paint over reality to make life easier. But then life arrives, peeling back each layer of expectation you've wrapped around the world. It doesn't do this to be cruel, but to set you free. Because only when you're no longer chained to what should have happened can you begin to live in what is actually happening. And that space where you see the truth as it is also the place where true inner power begins to form. 5. Redefining silence. It's no longer a punishment. As children, silence was punishment. It was the void after a mistake, the averted gaze, the answer that never came. We were taught that silence means rejection, exclusion, a sign that we no longer mattered to someone. And we grew up fearing silence, as if it were a dark room with no exit where you're locked in alone with questions no one will ever answer. But at some point, you must learn to redefine it, because if not, you'll forever live haunted by the need to fill the quiet with meaningless noise. The silence you once feared is really just a mirror reflecting what you've tried to avoid. Your own inner voice. When no one is telling you what to do, that's when the real question arises. What are you living for? Who are you chasing? What void are you filling with the presence of people who are never really going to stay? In that stillness, there is no applause, no agreement, no external response. Just you and the truth you can no longer escape. Many think silence is rejection, distance, coldness. But in truth, silence holds no fixed meaning. It reflects only what you bring into it. For someone still unhealed, silence feels like isolation. But for someone who has matured, silence becomes the sacred realm of freedom. You no longer need to reply just because someone spoke. You no longer need to fill every gap to prove your existence. You are present not because you need to be seen, but because you now understand your presence doesn't depend on noise. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Be silent, and you will see the world more clearly." This isn't just outer silence, but inner stillness where you no longer argue with yourself. No longer seek validation or justification from outside to legitimize the peace within. You no longer jump into every conversation to defend yourself. No longer explain every emotion to earn sympathy. No longer react to every glance, every word, every minor behavior from others. You begin to conserve energy not from fatigue, but from wisdom. Silence at the right time is the sign of a mind reaching higher ground. When you stop viewing silence as punishment, you begin using it as a tool. You don't respond immediately because you're observing. You don't speak first because you're choosing your timing. You don't need to speak the most because you've learned that the deepest echo often comes from the longest silence. And in this way, you're no longer pulled into the urgency of others, no longer absorbed by the chaos around you. You choose your own pace, your own rhythm, and that makes you untouchable. Silence, in the end, is not where you're imprisoned. It's where you walk in by choice to hear yourself, to reclaim your position, and to walk out steadier than ever before. 6. Presence needs no proof. Your presence doesn't need to be announced by volume. It doesn't need to be illustrated by action or validated by anyone else's attention. In a world where people constantly fight to be seen, you begin to understand this. Truth needs no stage to exist. The most valuable things are always quietly present, like air, like gravity, like the foundation beneath the ground. And people, when grounded enough, become the same. We used to believe that to exist, we had to be noticed. We had to say something profound, prove we were right, contribute something that made others pay attention. We thought that if we weren't acknowledged, we didn't exist. But that's the trap of an unsettled mind. Because those who need to be seen to feel valuable are still searching for themselves in others' reflections. They measure their existence by how often they're heard, how many eyes follow them, how many compliments affirm them. And so their presence becomes a product of external forces, not something rooted from within. When you begin to quiet down, when you stop forcing your way into every conversation, when you no longer rush to say something to secure your place in the room, you'll discover something strange. You're still there. You're still yourself, even when no one is watching. You don't vanish, even when no one nods in approval. And that is the turning point. That is when you stop needing to be seen because you have truly seen yourself. True presence doesn't come from effortful assertion. It comes from inner clarity. Those with inner strength don't need to raise their voice to be noticed. They don't need to enter with a spotlight. They only need to arrive with quiet certainty, and the room adjusts. They don't take up space with words, but with calmness. No one can explain why they command attention, but everyone feels it, because they don't generate push, they generate pull. And that kind of influence can't be memorized, copied, or borrowed. When you no longer need to prove anything, you become harder to manipulate. No one can shake you with their coldness. No one can force you to react just to prove you matter. You're no longer drawn into others' emotional games because you have nothing to bargain with. You don't need recognition. You don't need acceptance. You don't need to be chosen. You only need the honest presence of yourself, unpolished, non-negotiable. Epictetus once said, "The greatest freedom is not being dependent on anyone's approval." When you live by that principle, you don't need to enter a room playing a role. You only need to enter, and that's enough. Not to be heard, not to be praised, not to win, but simply to live fully, clearly, and without permission. 7. You no longer need permission to be strong. From a very young age, we were taught that to express something, we needed permission. To speak, we had to be asked. To resist, we had to be allowed. To be strong, we needed a reason. And so we grew up with a dangerous habit, waiting for someone else to give us the green light for the fire inside us. We suppressed our survival instinct, stifled our need to protect ourselves just to avoid being called too much, too cold, too different. But at some point, you must ask yourself, whose permission are you still waiting for to live? Strength is not a privilege reserved for those who are approved. Strength needs no validation, no certification. It's already within you, waiting to be claimed. But if you keep waiting for the world to grant you permission to stand tall, you'll remain shackled to other people's opinions. You'll never dare to walk firmly, because echoing in your mind is the question, will they think I'm being too harsh? Will I hurt someone by choosing myself? And that hesitation is what weakens you, not because you lack power, but because you're asking for permission to use it. Some people go through half their lives, never living their full strength because they're still apologizing for growing up. They bow when they should stand tall. They retreat when they should hold the line. They smile through pain all because of one fear, being seen as too strong. But if a little firmness unsettles others, that's not your fault. It's a mirror reflecting their own instability. True strength doesn't hurt anyone. It simply exposes the imbalance in relationships. The people who stay only when you're weak, the connections that only survive if you shrink yourself. Seneca once said, "No one is weak unless they convince themselves to be." And sometimes, the only thing you need to do to become strong is to stop asking for permission. Stop asking to say no. Stop asking to remain silent. Stop asking to not explain every decision. Stop asking to be sharp, unyielding, uncompromising. No one has the right to demand you soften just to be loved. No one can require you to be agreeable just to be worthy of trust. You don't need consensus to choose peace. You don't need a pat on the back to be allowed to change. You don't need others to believe in you before you begin to believe in yourself. Your strength doesn't lie in the number of people who recognize you. It lies in your ability to keep standing, keep moving, keep showing up without anyone by your side. And if you're still waiting for someone to tell you that you're allowed to become a stronger version of yourself, this is the moment to stop. No one's coming. No one needs to. Because you are already enough. You don't need to be chosen. You don't need to be liked. You don't need to be understood. You only need to live as someone who no longer asks for permission to be themselves. 8. Calm becomes the new language of strength. There comes a point in your inner journey when you realize you no longer need to speak quickly, react fiercely, or prove yourself through bursts of emotion. Anger no longer makes you feel in control. Sharp words no longer give you a sense of victory. Even well-timed reactions are no longer what you seek. Because you begin to see a different kind of strength, quieter, deeper, but more solid than anything you've known before. Calm. Calm is not apathy. It's the state of someone who has been swept up in too many emotional whirlwinds, who once reacted instinctively, who has both hurt and been hurt, and now chooses to step back. Not out of fear, but because they no longer need to fight to prove they are strong. Calm doesn't come from avoidance, it comes from the ability to observe everything without being pulled in. It's when you stand before an insult and feel no urge to retaliate. It's when you hear a distortion of truth and feel no need to correct it. It's when you see someone playing power games and choose not to participate. The world isn't used to this kind of strength. It's used to people who shout, react, glare, fight to be right. It doesn't know how to handle someone who simply watches and says nothing. It feels threatened by someone who doesn't need to win to feel secure. It can't understand why someone can be provoked and yet remain still. But that discomfort is proof. Calm is a language only those who've crossed the noisy terrain of ego can truly read. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Keep always before you the capacity to remain calm, even when everything is falling apart." That's not advice, it's a discipline. Because nothing is easier to lose than calm in a world designed to provoke. And nothing is more valuable than the one who can hold on to it, especially when they have every reason to let it go. That's when calm is no longer a slow reaction, it becomes a declaration of inner control. You no longer want to be the smartest voice in the room. You want to be the one who speaks the least, but at the right moment. You don't rush to defend your dignity because true dignity needs no defense. You don't put out every rumor because the truth handles that in time. And you no longer break the silence to make an impact because now you know some powers only emerge when everything else is quiet. The calm you choose is a message without words. It says you can't be manipulated, that you don't need to chase position, that you trust yourself enough not to react on others' terms. And when you live this way, you become a still point in the chaos, a presence so steady that others start adjusting their pace around you. That's when you're no longer the person who enters life with fury, but the one who brings silence sharp as a blade, yet without ever needing to be drawn. 9. When you no longer need to be seen, you become unignorable. There's a quiet paradox of the soul. The more you crave to be seen, the more you're overlooked. The more you try to attract attention, the easier it is to be dismissed. The more you care about others' eyes, the more you let them define your worth. But at some point, you stop seeking validation. You pull back the upward gaze and start focusing inward. Not because you've become colder, but because you've grown wise enough to know true presence is not where people are looking, it's where you no longer need them to look. The world admires those who don't try to impress, because they're rare, because they're free, because they don't react according to the crowd's logic. You walk into a room not to prove anything, but simply because you're there with stillness, with stability, with the strange gravity of someone who doesn't need attention but still draws it. And that doesn't come from performance, it comes from a soul forged in fire. Those who've strained to be recognized know how healing it feels to finally let go. You no longer say clever things just to impress, no longer curate images to be liked, no longer bend to please anyone just to remain in a safety zone built by others. You begin living differently in a way that earns no titles, yet stands like stone in spring rain. Marcus Aurelius didn't need speeches to be known as a philosopher. Seneca didn't seek fame when writing letters to Lucilius. Epictetus didn't wear luxurious robes to make his students listen in silence. They didn't pursue outer presence because their power was already present within. And so are you. When you understand that your worth doesn't require external recognition, you free yourself from the prison of public approval. And when you no longer need to be seen, you begin to radiate something that no one can ignore. You no longer show up to draw attention. You show up to protect your inner order. You don't raise your voice to overpower others. You speak little, but every word strikes deep. You don't jump into every conversation, but when you speak, people listen. Your presence doesn't come from volume, but from depth. Not from appearance, but from essence. Not from being chosen, but from having claimed yourself in every breath, every choice, every unhurried step. The person who no longer needs the spotlight is often the one who turns heads precisely because they've stopped trying. Not because they're loud, but because they've become the place where all noise ends. 10. You don't need anyone's recognition because your presence is the proof. We used to believe recognition was the ultimate reward for effort. That if we were good enough, persistent enough, enduring enough, the world would nod. It would grant us a title, a compliment, a place, an open embrace. But the truth is, recognition is not the destination of value. It's just an echo from the outside, while true value always comes from within. And at some point you realize you don't need anyone's nod, because your steady presence is already a silent but undeniable affirmation. Strong people don't live to be praised. They don't measure themselves by how satisfied others are. They don't walk into a room to be welcomed. They walk in, and their presence alone makes the room go silent. They don't live as a self-promotion campaign, but as a being forged by fire. They don't need to convince anyone they're trustworthy because every gesture, every word, every silence is already the proof. You don't need recognition when you no longer define yourself by external eyes. Your steadiness doesn't need to be written into a description. No one needs to label you for you to exist. No title needs to be handed to make you valuable. The one who doesn't need praise is the one who does the right thing, dares to face difficulty, dares to keep going even when no one is cheering, and is brave enough to stand firm when everything falls apart. And when you are that person, there's nothing left to prove, because you yourself are the proof. Epictetus once said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it." Don't say you're steadfast, be the one who doesn't waver when met with resistance. Don't say you're noble, be the one who doesn't retaliate when insulted. Don't say you're strong, be the one who stands tall even when no one notices. Truth doesn't live in others' mouths. It lives in how you show up, in how you keep your values intact without having to preach, in how you choose silence at the right moment, walk in the right direction, and never look back to see what others think. You don't need anyone to lift you because you're not standing on anyone's shoulders. You stand on failures you didn't complain about. on hard choices you didn't whine through, on long nights you never spoke of. And that's why no one can bring you down, because no one ever lifted you up with their approval. You are not the product of applause. You are the result of awareness. When you show up as someone who no longer needs recognition, you make the world go silent. Not because you demand attention, but because you've lived so truthfully that no one has any reason left to doubt you. You don't need a spotlight. You don't need a title. You don't need anyone to arrive and say you're enough. Because when you exist as living proof, your presence is already the loudest voice in the room. I was once someone who always wanted to be understood, always afraid of being misunderstood, always longing for someone perceptive enough to see me amid a silent crowd. But then I realized what exhausted me wasn't the indifference of the world, it was the expectation that the world should be different. I once strained to please, to be accepted, to not be forgotten. But the harder I tried, the further I drifted from myself. And the moment I let go, no longer hoping to be accepted, no longer needing recognition, something strange happened. I started seeing myself more clearly, walking more lightly, speaking less but with more certainty. No one came to pat my back, no one nodded, but I stood up. Because I no longer needed anyone's permission to do so. The strength you've been searching for may have been there all along. It's just been waiting for you to stop asking permission to live as someone who is already enough. And enough means you no longer need to prove it. If you found value in what was shared, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss future content. Maybe you won't say much, but choosing to stay that alone is a powerful act. Because the Stoic journey isn't for those in a hurry, but for those who want to stand firm in silence. Be the one who doesn't need to be seen, but still makes the world go silent when you walk in. See you in the next video.